Whatever you want.
Okay, we're recording, and welcome to another episode of Hagley History Hangout, the podcast from the Hagley Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society. And today we're interviewing Mark Aldrich, the Marilyn Carlson Nelson Professor Emeritus of Economics at Smith College, about his most recent book, The Rise and Fall of King Coal, American Energy Transitions in an Age of Markets, 1800 to 1940. And I'm Ben Spohn of Hagley. So, Mark, thank you for joining us again. People might recognize you from previous Hagley History Hangout, Back on Track. But today we're talking about something that quite often historically got called on the tracks. I know that's far from the whole story. So can you tell us a little bit about what this book is?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Um, I've been interested in energy for all sorts of reasons for a long time. I think some of it had to do with chopping firewood when I was a kid, and some of it had to do with tending an old coal furnace, and the usual sorts of things that economic historians, of which I'm one, uh, come to understand. And you come to understand that American standard of living, mine now, for example, is so much higher than it was a generation or two before. And it sort of dawned on me that one of the things that implied is that I don't stoke a coal furnace. And you put that together with the sorts of things that you inevitably learn. I taught a course in environmental and natural resource economics, and you learn a lot about energy and energy history there. And I sort of decided that I wanted to talk about America's energy history uh, because it seemed to me that there was I read a lot in the field, I think, and a lot of good stuff. But one of the things that was missing was just how important it has been uh, for the standard of living of everyday people like you and me, who are vastly better off than they once were, and that a lot of that payoff never gets caught by economists when they try to measure things like the standard of living. Anyway, long-winded answer to a short question, as usual.
Yeah, that's interesting, but that is what the whole book is. How did you arrive at your periodization then to do 1800 through 1940?
Well, the more I read, the more I realized that if I decided to look at modern materials, I'd be reinventing the wheel. There is a lot of very good material written on post World War II energy, and uh, and after World War II, energy is impossible to talk about without talking about the importance of public policy. And I'm an economist. We like to talk about markets. We bore everyone to death talking about markets. And until you get to World War II, the energy transitions that I talked about are mostly market driven. Not entirely, you can overstate the case, and I try not to, but mostly. And that's why I subtitled the book Energy Transitions in the Age of Markets, because the age of markets, when they dominated, uh, has changed now. Public policy is so much more important. And 1800, well, uh, being an economist, I'm a numbers guy. And the numbers before 1800, and even somewhat after that, aren't very good. So I thought that's as good a starting point as any. That takes us back to a world of wood, a world of horses, uh, and a world of strong backs. And that's what energy was in 1800. And so I thought this would be uh, a nice beginning. And it's about the rise and fall of old King Coal over that period. Coal comes from almost nothing in 1800 to dominate by 1900. And then there's a long goodbye, although with rumors of his death have been greatly exaggerated, but it's been a long goodbye.
Yes, I wanted to talk about that because you have, chapter three itself is called The Long Goodbye, full title, Soft Coal and Industry, 1900 to 1940, The Long Goodbye in specific. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit more because that really struck me as it's a 40-year period of a 120-year story. So that's what I'm bad at math. A third of your time.
Yeah, that's a third of it. Hmm.
And to this day, we still haven't fully said goodbye to it. Why do you think that is? What does it
Well,
mean?
well, coal. What I tried to do in that chapter was um, pick up coal roughly at its apogee, right around World War One, when it looked like it was the dominant fuel, and it would stay the dominant fuel forever. And in cooking at home, in heating at home, and in industry, on railroads, you name it, that was coal. Period. And that's energy transitions don't happen overnight. Coal took a century to get where it got. They don't happen overnight, but they started to happen right around World War One. Uh, and you, the story with anthracite is, of course, somewhat different from the story with soft coal, bituminous coal. And I tried to separate them and tell them differently. And I talked about anthracite mostly as a domestic fuel, urban, uh, Eastern cooking and heating. And that ran into essentially a package it couldn't deal with. Anthracite's great advantage was its cleanliness compared to soft coal, which is unbelievably dirty. But anthracite was expensive. And all of a sudden, as incomes rise, people get more and more interested in cleanliness and so on. And gas starts to take bites out of its market, and a whole bunch of other substitutes too. But the dominant one is manufactured gas, which is made out of soft coal. So it's like one kind of coal is eating the other. But the long retreat of anthracite really is because of its role in cooking. It was driven out by manufactured gas, and later its role in heating is driven out mostly by natural gas, but some other fuels too. Bituminous coal, that's the fuel of industry, and of course the railroads and so on. And what I talked about there was, again, two things: some technological changes and discoveries, especially in gas at this time. I mean, natural gas had been around since the 1820s or 30s, and all these eastern fields would open up. There would be a boom in gas. It would be like a land rush. And they would, because of the rule of capture, the gas belonged to whoever had it. Um, Everybody would pump like mad, and they'd run out of gas, and that field would collapse. And that would happen in New York, happen in Illinois, happened all over the place. And by World War One, pretty much the experts were saying, well, there isn't any more natural gas. Most of these cities are going to have to convert back to manufactured gas. That turned out not to be true. We start to get discoveries of natural gas, huge ones in the Southwest, Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, and so on, giant gas finds. And that and some innovation in technology means gas all of a sudden becomes a national competitor. And it moves into the Midwest. So you get natural gas is being shipped from Texas to Chicago. You can buy it for 6 cents a 1,000 feet in Texas and sell it for 12 and make a buck doing it. And the gas producers, they go after the market in the industrial as well as the domestic market. And gas has enormous advantages as a fuel. So one of the things that coal runs into at this time is competition from other fuels, less so from oil. at least in manufacturing, more from natural gas. And of course, the other thing it runs into is one of the themes in this book is that American energy history has not been simply a riot of waste, although there have been plenty of it. Uh, Companies, big companies, they don't waste fuel just for the fun of it. Uh, it's always struck me as strange that the progressives of 1900 denounced these grasping monopolists in the anthracite industry or Standard Oil or so on, and then accused these grasping, greedy men of wasting energy. Well, that seems like a contradiction in terms to me, and they didn't. And you start to see, uh, especially after World War One, there's a huge price spike in energy in World War One, and the shortages, and the U.S. Fuel Administration starts allocating. You're going to get less coal than you once did, and this touches off uh, an increased focus on conservation, and you start to see some quite dramatic changes. And this goes on at a time when what I call an energy network of people has really come to fruition. Uh, you see the specialty journals uh, popping up that focus on the particular problems of a particular industry. And one of the things they will talk about is the way that companies can save energy, and they spread the word. You see journals popping up that focus on one particular aspect of energy. Combustion is the name of one of the journals. Coal age is the name of another. And so you get this energy network where people, when they come up with better ideas, they publish them. And I focused on the importance of the electric utility industry, not so much as a seller of electricity, but as an innovator, because their market is growing very rapidly. Energy is a very expensive part of their costs, and they have very strong interest in figuring out ways to save energy, and they're good at it. And they publish their results, and you get a kind of technological convergence here that what works for the electric utilities can be translated into something that will work for, say, a manufacturing company too. And they publish this information in these journals, and others pick up on it. And so I did some calculations, and I've forgotten the figures now. I didn't look those up, but in manufacturing between, I don't know, 1910 and 1940, you get very sharp declines in energy use per dollar of manufacturing product that time. So that's again a long answer to your question, but it's an increased focus on conservation and efficiency on the one hand, and the coal loses markets big time to gas. They start picking them off because gas has attributes that coal can't match. It's clean, and where you need clean manufacturing, coal is not your fuel.
To put it mildly.
Yeah, and of course, what coal has, its one great advantage is cost. It's cheaper than anything else, and that's why it hung on as long as it did in utilities. You can burn it for boiler fuel, and you pulverize it first, and it burns like a gas. And it's hung on to this day throughout the world. But even though, you know, I was astounded to read the other day. I don't keep up on what goes on in the steel industry very much anymore, but a coke oven plant blew up. And most places don't make steel that way anymore. At least it's my understanding that mostly it's electric furnaces and so on and so forth. U.S. Steel is still using coke. But by and large, coal is the fuel of boilers for electricity generation now, and not much else.
And even then, it seems to be moving in an ever declining direction.
Yeah. Again, natural gas was always a competitor, but with fracking, gas became much cheaper, much more available, and it's been pushing coal out. Now, of course, public policy has been also pushing coal out. Uh, but gas was pushing coal out before public policy began. You can go back and I looked at the numbers. You look back to the 1930s, and coal's share of utilities is falling. Now, its absolute amount was going up because the electric utility business just exploded between, say, 1920 and 1950 or 60, pick a date. So they burned more coal, but coal had a smaller fraction of the business.
I've also noticed in a lot of our conversations so far, you've been referring to World War One as sort of this tipping point in coal, or at least
Mhm.
that's what it seems like to me. Can you perhaps expand upon that a little bit?
it it's convenient both as a date because anthracite really hits its maximum about 1917, uh, and it never comes back. And coal hits a high point in, I don't know, right around then. I don't remember the date. Let's say 1918, though I may be off by a year or so. Coal, we burn more coal now than we did in 1918. Okay. But what happens to coal, that is soft coal, excuse me, what happens to soft coal is even though people at the time were predicting that, oh, there'll be we'll be using so many billion tons in 1940, that didn't happen. It declined very rapidly. And only the boom of World War II briefly brought coal back, and then it sags again. And then it finally hits peacetime level of production that exceeds 1918, sometime after World War II. So it is a very long period when soft coal is declining. And that's what I focused on. World War One is the peak, but as I said earlier, World War One also is a focusing device for all everybody who's interested in energy because of the spike in prices in energy and and the shortages at that time. Now, some of the shortages are literally shortages of coal. Some of it are because the railroads basically stopped working in about 1917, and so the coal couldn't get to markets. But whatever the reason was, you couldn't get coal. And I remember some of the advertisements that the gas industry would make in the 1920s. It would be a reference to the fact that no shortages. And people with long memories, oh, that's right, we couldn't get coal back then, and so on, like that. So World War One is an important moment, both as a marker when these fuels hit their peak, and also causal, that it really did uh, sharply focus people on energy saving. Of course, it
It was,
also, go ahead, excuse me.
oh no, I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
Okay. One of the things it also did is it changed the focus of policymakers. They were all worried about running out of coal, which, as I wrote, I think in the preface, that may strike you as a little strange, and it does me, but that was the focus of people at that time. But the focus shifts because World War One demonstrates, especially to the Europeans, but also to the Americans, the centrality of oil for national defense. And this is a time when everyone was predicting, oh, we're going to run out of oil. Oh, we're going to run out of gas. I mean, the predictions, and it's always about in 10 or 20 years, we're going to run out. And you could have a long list of the people who made these predictions, and all the experts were predicting this. And so the experts at this time, they're worried about mostly preserving oil and gas. The focus shifts. And the reason they're interested in conserving coal is they are hoping that if we can figure out some way to make coal conservation economic, it'll be cheaper, and then people will burn coal and save oil and gas. So it's that kind of convoluted argument that begins to shape policymakers' thinking in the 1930s. And I think does after World War II also. But anyway, certainly in the period I studied.
Yeah, well, that's interesting too, because I did want to talk a little bit about how much the government has its thumb on the scales for that final 20-year section of what you're looking at. And I did also want to perhaps talk about a little bit more about coal leaving the domestic sphere and these energy transitions in the domestic sphere in particular. Because I think Hagley, we focus a lot on business and industry, and fair enough, but we do get a little bit less in that side of things, and that's what your final two chapters are.
Yeah, that for me, that was the most fun to write and to research. And as I said when we began this, I remember tending a coal furnace. And it was an educational experience. It was cold, it was hard work, it was dirty. And anyway, I started doing research on domestic fuels, so on. And what struck me is how much better these energy transitions made the lives of very, very ordinary Americans. And my favorite has always been what I wrote about for farm women. By the way, some of which, by the way, came from Hagley. But farm women, of course, in those days, they worked all the time. And they're in charge of parts of the farm. They do all the cooking and washing, and they did it with coal and wood stoves. And there were a number of farm journals at the time, and the women write into them. And invariably, they talk about what it's like doing canning on an August afternoon when you're in Iowa and you got a coal stove. And they're quite eloquent about this. More or less, it's hotter than hell. It's just debilitating. And some of what they write about this is funny. They have a good sense of humor, but they find this work very difficult. And I wrote about how kerosene for cooking comes into their lives. This is a time before electricity, and unless you live in this pretty good sized town or city, you don't have gas. So what do you cook with? Well, you cook with mostly wood or coal or corn cobs or buffalo chips, or they call that barnyard lignite in those days. And then kerosene comes in, and the early kerosene stoves are flimsy little things, and I talk about that. They start out as basically somebody had this idea, we got a kerosene light. If we put a top on it, we could cook a hamburger. And they evolved into fairly serious stoves. When I moved into the house that I live in now, an old 18th century house, I found a kerosene stove here. They didn't have electricity, and they certainly didn't have gas in my little town. That's what women cooked with. And kerosene stoves were much easier to use. You could move them out on the porch to do your canning in the summer. And I wrote, my subtitle in that chapter was Cooking Shouldn't Cook the Cook. And I believe that was one of the ads. Rockefeller's Standard Oil sold, in addition to kerosene, it sold kerosene stoves too, oil stoves. And you can see a similar thing going on for urban women as they shift from coal to gas. It lightens their step. It's less dirty. it takes less time. And this is a immeasurable gain in their welfare. And I cited, in fact, I began the chapter on the farm woman with a story of a woman who actually lived about 30 miles south of where I am now in Hatfield, Massachusetts. And she wrote a piece in a journal called Farmer's Wife about how she got into the business of home canning. She canned 1919. She bought a kerosene stove to do it because she knew she couldn't do it with coal. The heat would have killed her. She canned 1,400 jars of preserves one summer. I've canned preserves. I know what it's like to do that, and I cannot imagine doing that. And she did it to make a little money, as she said. And I said, you know, this isn't a bad summary of America's history. This woman using a new fuel, and she's an entrepreneur, and she's trying to raise her standard of living, and she's trying to do it in a way that makes her life easier too. And that isn't a bad summary of what my book is about, I think. And that shows up in cooking for women. It shows up in house heating, where, again, you go back to 1900, most people heat with stoves. They heat with coal or wood. A few well-to-do people heat with central heat, and that's coal too. And if coal gets in the furnace, if you're wealthy enough, you have somebody come and stoke it for you. But if you're not, you're the one who does it. It has to be stoked 3 or 4 times a day at least, usually more. And people's incomes are rising after, say, World War I. And so coal is a dirty fuel, and it's vulnerable for that. And what I found interesting was especially the way both fuel oil and natural gas went after that market. One of the points I try to make in this book is that, as I put it, America may have been having an abundance of energy, but the coal doesn't hop out of the ground and nestle into your stove. That requires a lot of technology, a lot of entrepreneurship, and it requires marketing. People have to have it explained to them, and then have to have it sold to them about why this is a better fuel. And the oil burner people are ferocious marketers. They get into the business right after World War I, and they've got a really much better product, because you can, if you've got electricity, you need that. You have a thermostat. And in fact, you can hook it up to a clock as early as the 1920s. So you've got automatic heat. Nobody had ever had that before. To my knowledge, in the history of the human race, nobody had ever had that. You can set the thermostat for 70 degrees and you don't have to stoke the darn furnace. And not only that, the people marketing this are really sharp, and they have a good time. They market it to women by emphasizing the fact that they don't have to go down and stoke the furnace when the husband's out, and that it's clean. And one of the companies has its motto: "No coal shovel was ever made to fit a woman's hand." And they have a great time with that. Another company has a skit where they're peddling these furnaces in Boston, and they have a skit to try to sell furnaces. It is called "Freedom of the She's," not the C's, the She's, which I thought was a nice pun. And they are good at marketing. They also play on male guilt. You know, why should you be in a nice oil-heated office when your wife is home having to stoke the furnace? And that seems to work too. These people bite off a good chunk of the market. At about this time, natural gas comes into the Midwest too. And the gas companies are ferocious marketers too. They've been trying to sell manufactured gas for home heat. And manufactured gas is expensive. And so the only people who are going to buy it are fairly well-to-do. So you got a pretty thin market. Natural gas comes in, it's got twice the heating value of manufactured gas, and it's cheaper. So they have all of a sudden got a much better product, and they go after the home heating market in a very sophisticated way, the way the Marines hit the beach, and they they have testimonials in the Chicago papers from some of their customers that are powerful, and what the customers are saying, I don't have to get up in the middle of the night to tend the furnace. My wife doesn't have to wash the walls because of the coal soot, and so on. That's pretty hard to cope with if you are selling coal furnaces and coal. And I wrote the coal tries to make a comeback, but basically they're just selling an inferior product. There's no way you can make coal clean, and there's virtually no way you can make it automatic. And as people get richer, and they were by 1930 or 1935, even in the Depression, they get richer, you want more cleanliness, and you're willing to pay a price for it. So even if natural gas is a little more expensive, it's so much better. And anyway, that was, for me, that was the most meaningful stuff that I did, because it connected to my life very personally, and to the life of people I know, and and it's a window into the improvements that all of us have experienced, and I thought that was a very important thing, and I probably beat the horse to death, but I stressed that most of these uh, amenities, I guess is what you would say, these don't get picked up in the numbers of GDP per capita or disposable income per capita. All these measures of the standard of living, they don't get that. So we're much better off than the numbers lead you to believe,
Hmm.
which I
I
thought
agree.
worth a point worth uh, making, if not necessarily beating to death.
I agree. I think that point is absolutely worth making. I know what drew my interest to this book when we were divvying up what our podcast episodes for the next season would be, was my personal experience growing up in a house where our main source of heat was an anthracite burning coal stove.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And how little I miss that experience of
Yes.
dealing with it, especially with collecting and disposing of the coal ash.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Right. When I was a young man, we had the energy crisis of the 1970s, and I had, as a boy, uh, cut some firewood. Not a ton of it. We didn't heat with firewood, but enough to know what it was like. But most of the people I was with when I began teaching, they're all city boys. And oh, the price of oil went up. We're going to heat with wood. And I thought that ain't going to last. So they all went out and they bought chainsaws. Well, it turns out if you're going to heat with wood, you're going to have anywhere from 7 to 10 cord a year. That's a lot of firewood to cut and split. And so this lasted about a year or two. And then they suddenly decided maybe we're not going to heat with wood. It is just backbreaking work to do. So yeah, those kinds of uh-huh uh, experiences were very powerful to me, and I judge to you too.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Something else that I thought was a very interesting, I guess I'll call it a theme that comes up a few times in your book, in both the industrial and the domestic sphere, was the dynamism of these energy transitions, how things shifted based off of what you needed at the time and what perhaps was most economical, with in particular the rural women switching between kerosene and corn cobs, and also the Western Railroad switching between oil burning for the locomotives and coal burning for locomotives, depending on what prevailing conditions called for.
Yeah, one of the economists can bore anyone to death talking about the wonders of markets. It's a little bit like getting a biologist to talk about species and how evolution works. You can't shut them up. And the, people not only shift back and forth, and you could, as you said, the railroads were doing it. You could apparently convert a coal locomotive to oil in less than a day if the price of oil merited doing it, and so on. And one of the things I remember when I was reading about, again, farm women, is the differences that you would find among what various women did. And one of the reasons economists like markets, is that it allows people in different circumstances to do different things. It isn't one size fits all, it's many sizes are available. And so depending upon your income or the region that you have, you might burn this, you might burn that, you might burn this in the summer and that in the winter. And I remember reading a study of I think it was farm women in Indiana, and they burned they cooked with everything from electricity to corn cobs, depending upon, and I assume that depended upon whether or not they had access to electricity, whether or not they could afford it, how much wood they might have had, the price of coal, and cost of kerosene, and so on and so forth. And so that kind of very fine-grained ability of markets to allow people to make choices depending upon their own circumstances. So one of the things that economists like about them, they let you do that sort of thing. You don't have to do the same thing that your neighbor did, unless you want. One thing you talked about Hagley. Let me put in a plug for Hagley. I've used, especially material I wrote on railroads, I used Hagley material a lot, but that also carried over to this. And in several ways, one of the things I found out when I did the work on railroads was just how interested they were in economy. And that shows up in fuel very much. It's a big part of their costs. And I used Pennsylvania Railroad records again. And the Pennsylvania was important for two reasons. One is endless attempts to figure out ways to save fuel and connections with the other railroads and so on and so forth. And they're all trying to figure out how to do this. In part, they're doing that just to save fuel, but in part because the regulators are after them, and that makes the railroads different. The regulators are after them because they're burning coal in Chicago and they're stinking the joint up. And so, the regulators don't like that. So they're interested in saving fuel. And late 19th century, these European railroads discover how to burn oil in an old locomotive. Turns out it begins in Russia, and it gets published in a British journal. And the Americans pick right up on it. One of the points I tried to make throughout this book is that there really is a transatlantic energy community. There's a lot of back and forth between the Americans and the Europeans. The Americans know what's going on in Europe. They're not insular at all. And the Pennsylvania Railroad perks up its ears, and they send one of their very important people, one of their scientists, over to talk with the guy who had figured out how to burn oil in the locomotives, and he writes back, yes, that works. And the Pennsylvania does a lot of experiments on it. And basically what the Pennsylvania concludes is it doesn't work for us because it's uneconomic. It costs more to burn oil than it does coal, period. So the Pennsylvania never shifts to oil until you get to diesel.
Mm-hmm.
But the Western railroads are in a different situation. A lot of Western states don't have very good coal. California is the best example. It's got either no coal or lousy coal. And you start getting oil finds. And the oil is mostly used for kerosene. And that means that there's residual. And it's waste. So it goes for virtually nothing. And that means you can buy it for the railroads. And so the Southern Pacific and the Santa Fe become pioneers in figuring out how to burn oil in an old steam locomotive. And the oil finds in Texas and Oklahoma mean oil becomes economic in a much wider part of the country. It never, until the diesels, it never penetrates the East. But it gets into, as far east as the Middle West, Kansas. And the railroads are like the sort of thing that, you teach introductory students about how businesses are supposed to make choices. And they're little automatons, responding to relative prices like a shot. And of course, that isn't always the case, but it certainly was with the railroads. The Santa Fe would burn oil on one division in Kansas and coal on another division because one was cheaper in one and one was cheaper in another. And then the prices would change and they'd switch. So they burn oil, and then forgotten, I think it was the Northern Pacific was burning oil. And all of a sudden they discover on their own property a ton of cheap lignite, brown coal. They abandon the oil like the homeless boy at the dance, and they burn coal again. So you go back and forth. Yeah, the businesses are very very alert to that sort of thing, and that was what I was trying to get across when I talked about conservation and waste and efficiency and so on. It's those are abstractions, but for them to mean anything, you've got to see them at work. And I tried to breathe life into those abstractions with some of those kinds of examples, like the lady down from me who bought the kerosene stove and did the cooking. Edith Hawley was her name.
Anything interesting at Hagley from the Reading, perchance, since they kind of are the semi-unique in the field anthracite hauler?
Only as background for me. I didn't use specifically the Reading records for this, only as background. And what they did was they informed my understanding of anthracite, which I wrote about in there because I'd used the Reading records earlier. Both I used Reading records, same reason I used other coal records, Stoning and so on. I'm interested in safety. But if you're interested in safety, you're also interested in mechanization. And both of those come up in this book. And so I didn't use them specifically for this, but I got out my own notes, let's put it that way, on this, because when the progressives talked about conservation, well, what they tended to mean was fuel conservation, but they also meant conservation of life, human life, that American industry was wasting human life. So the safety movement and the energy movement are actually kissing cousins. And I make that point several times in the book, that anthracite had an evil reputation as a killer of men, especially underground anthracite, and it gets worse when the mines mechanize, for example. I made the point that strip mining is conservation, which strikes modern ears as a little strange. But if your focus is on natural resources like coal and oil and so on, strip mining is conservation in two senses. It certainly conserved coal. And the people writing about it were very candid about that. They said it makes an awful mess of the farmland. They were strip mining, say, in Illinois. But the farmland's mostly worthless anyway at that time. And you get a lot more coal. And people have to be heated, have to have heat in their house as well as food in their house. So it's conservation that way. And it also conserves human lives. Strip mining is a whole lot less dangerous, whether it's for anthracite or uh, soft coal than was underground mining. It saves lives for two reasons. It's less dangerous per worker, and you don't need anywhere near as many people exposed to danger. Labor productivity is a lot higher than that. So you get people mining coal with steam shovels that are bigger than a barn, just biggest things on land. And what that means is you don't need anywhere near as many people, and there's no roof to fall in on them either. And that's what killed most of the underground miners. Is half of them would be killed in roof falls. Half the miners that were killed in roof falls. So it's in a strange way, it was a kind of conservation, and I thought that was a point worth making.
No, it certainly is a provocative idea, the idea that strip mining does save something as we live with some of the downstream environmental consequences today. But
Well, yeah, one of the things that struck me is if you asked somebody in Pennsylvania to talk about stream and river pollution in 1920, what he would have been talking about probably was all the wasted coal that was in those streams. And but now we wouldn't be talking about that. We'd be talking about the effect the wasted coal have on the trout or on the people. But the concerns in those days were that the coal dust and small stuff was just thrown out and it washed into the creek and it was wasted. And so you begin to get recycling of this old coal begins not late 19th century, and it booms during World War One. And so they're mining the Susquehanna.
mm-hmm.
Okay. And the focus of conservation is not the Susquehanna. They're not mining it to clean up the Susquehanna for the trout and the swimmers. They're mining because they want the coal. And by the time you get to the 1930s, though, you read some of the writing that's been done on that, and you can sense a shift in what people are beginning to be concerned about. They're not as concerned now about the finding the coal. They're concerned that the streams are being clogged, and the acid from the mines is affecting the fish, and so you can really see a shift beginning in what people are focusing on. Again, probably in some part because we're richer than we once were, and that begins to show up very, very gradually, a long time ago.
Indeed. No, I think that's a very interesting point because in putting it in broader Hagley context, we've had researchers who are concerned about very early 19th century sort of water pollution
Mm-hmm.
because the DuPonts had a vested interest in making sure that the Brandywine was clear of debris so it could power the gunpowder mills. And it's not in the modern context, but it still does something.
Oh yeah, yeah. One of the points I was trying to make is that not a novel point by any means, is that conservation has a different meaning to us than it did back then. And we need to approach that time and those people on their own terms. What they thought was important, why they thought it was important, and so on and so forth. Now that's as I said, that's not a novel point. Lots of people have pointed out that the great difference in the environmental movement was between what's his name now, John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt. Muir wanted to preserve the wilderness for beauty, and Roosevelt wanted to preserve it to save the trees so you could cut them down. You know, that kind of utilitarian view versus the aesthetic view. So my point isn't new, but what I wanted to do was to show what the implications of it were. Like strip mining is in fact conservation. That sort of thing.
Right. And a lot of, just to bookmark our listeners, a lot of what we've been talking about the last several minutes is from chapter 8.
Yeah, that's right. The one of the ways the railroads tried to strike back, I point out that strip mining was basically the only way they had that worked very well to reduce costs. And that, but the other way they tried to strike back, of course, was research was going to discover vast new markets for coal. And the 20s had research was trendy in the 1920s. Manufacturers had discovered the payoff to research. And so we got these wonderful products in the 20s and the 30s. Nylon comes out. The oil companies figure out how to crack petroleum so you can get much more gasoline from it. Research really is riding high, and all kinds of industries start doing research. And the people involved or associated with coal, they think that research can save coal's fortunes. Well, it turns out that it couldn't. The idea was you were going to convert coal into a liquid fuel, and that's been a glint in the eye of public policymakers from the 30s up to the 1980s. Every time oil jumps in price, somebody thinks about that. At least they used to. I think it's finally dead, but they were going to try to convert coal to oil, and there's a booming interests in that in the 1930s. But essentially by World War II, American businesses had figured out it's not going to work. It just is. You can't make it economic. It works technically, but you can't make it. The Germans ran much of their war machine in World War II off of coal oil that came from coal, synthetic oil. But you couldn't do it economically. And as far as I know, you still can't.
Hmm.
It was an idea that for the coal industry, it would have been salvation. It would have turned the tables on their torturers, and suddenly the market for coal would have exploded, but it didn't. And one of the things I point out, markets are pretty good at cutting losses, and you can see that in that business. There's a great interest in it in 1920. By 1935, it is deader than a doornail.
So one more thing I'd like to return to, well, perhaps two things, but one more thing I'd like to return to right now before we move into the conclusion is I had written down that you mentioned that some of your information about rural women and domestic energy use had come from Hagley. Can you say anything more about that?
Yeah, Hagley has an oral history collection. I can't remember the name of it now. I should have prepped on that, and I didn't. And I found a wonderful example of the kind of thing that I was trying to illustrate in this book. It's a woman who's talking about her mother. So it's previous generation. It would have been her mother would have been about 1900. And her mother does canning, like virtually every farm woman and rural small town woman did. And what does she do? She leaves the old cook stove in the kitchen, and she gets a kerosene stove and she wheels it out onto the porch, and she does her canning out there, and also her ironing out there. If I recall, many women did. They do the ironing out there for the same reason, that this is before the world of air conditioning, I guess is the way to put it. And I used to can, and I can remember not wheeling the stove out on the porch, but setting up a Coleman stove out on the porch and canning off the Coleman stove for exactly the same reason. It was stiflingly hot trying to do canning in August.
Yes. That sounds like that comes from our Brandywine Valley
Yes,
oral
yes,
history collection.
yes, it does. It does. And I used yours and a number of other archives like that are, if you happen to find one that fits, they're gold. They're wonderful. And
Yeah. Yes, no, and I love hearing stories about finding that particular collection in the wild as the oral historian in my day job.
so are you?
Um,
That's right. You are. I knew that. I knew that. Yeah. Yeah.
um, The other thing that we haven't talked about very much today, or perhaps because we've interwoven it more so rather than explicitly called it out, is the first two chapters on the rise of King Coal. Is there anything more you'd like to say about that? Or do you think we've kind of have addressed it in that sidelong way?
Uh, one of the one of the things I tried to point out was the role that geography and geology and transportation play in energy markets. Energy is going to be moved. As I said, it doesn't hop out of the ground and into your furnace. It's got to be found, got to be mined, got to be moved. And if you look at the 19th century, the first uh, beginnings of the transformation away from wood is to anthracite. And the reason for that is the United States is settled east to west, and the major cities are on the East Coast in 18, 20, 30, 40, 50. And anthracite is in eastern Pennsylvania. Now, it's miserably difficult to mine and miserably difficult to transport. So it's in eastern and also to burn. Did I mention that? And so it takes a lot of work to get it to market. But by the time you get to, let's say, 1830, wood's getting scarce. And wood prices are rising. And there's some entrepreneurs in eastern Pennsylvania who figure out, if we can figure out a way to get this darn stuff to market and how to burn it, there's a big market for it. And they do. And you get anthracite canals and so on. And I talk about that. So the geography of anthracite, if you can figure out how to get it from eastern Pennsylvania to the seaboard, means anthracite is going to be the first coal used. And it pretty much is. Coal is used west of the Alleghenies, but most manufacturing isn't there by 1840 or 50. So Eastern industrialization is founded on anthracite. And that begins to change when you get to about, let's say, 1850. Pennsylvania Railroad completes its line to the west. And it has competition there. New York railroads are trying to build west and so on and so forth. So you suddenly can now start to be able to bring soft coal to the East Coast. So the railroads start competing with canals, both for anthracite, but also for soft coal. And that starts to come to the east, and it's cheaper, even if you have to haul it from Pittsburgh. So you begin to see a shift from anthracite to soft coal. And soft coal was found everywhere. I think it was mined in 30 states by 1860 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty easy to mine compared to anthracite. So geology has favored soft coal by spreading it around a lot and making it easier to mine. And so once the transportation is available, soft coal starts to take off, and it continues to drive wood out of domestic fuel and railroads and steamboats and so on. And I talk about that. And it drives anthracite out. By 1900, anthracite is no longer used very much in manufacturing or on the railroads. It's mostly a domestic fuel. And it's mostly a domestic fuel on the East Coast. So anthracite had once been burned in Chicago, but by the time you get to 1880 or 90, Chicago's becoming nearly as smoky as Pittsburgh, because they've shifted from anthracite to soft coal. So even in the domestic markets, anthracite sees its markets mostly shifting towards the east. New England, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and so on, like that. So that's what I tried to stress, was there's a sort of interplay of geology, geography, and technology that drive these broad changes. And again, this is all part of a market economy in which prices reflect these realities. And the result of this is anthracite rises and then begins its decline as an industrial fuel, and soft coal booms again until about World War One.
And I think that's a interesting transition to go to the conclusion, especially as coal remains that thing we can't quite quit. I'm instantly thinking personally about anthracite here in the eastern half of Pennsylvania, and how to this day, if you head to the tracks owned by the Reading Blue Mountain and Northern, you'll still see trains full of anthracite heading southward. Nowhere near the volume it once was, but we haven't quite quit it yet.
Well, one of the things I point out is old technologies never die. They fade away, but they rarely die. And that's also true of fuels. I mean, wood hangs on in the margins too. People still heat with it around here where I am. Up in the hills in Massachusetts, it's cheap. Well, at least it used to be. I'm not sure it is anymore. I priced out some cordwood a while ago and went into shock from it. But yeah, that's very common, that you don't get 100% energy transitions. So, in fact, people have said, "Oh, there's no such thing as an energy transition," because we're still burning coal. And so, well, that's that guy like Gertrude Stein has trouble with shades of difference. We don't burn anywhere near the share of coal that we used to burn. So yeah, it's still around, and I can't see that it going away unless you ban it. Now, if somehow or other it becomes illegal to burn coal or wood or something, then it will probably go away, or there'll be a black market. I don't know which, but it'll be around, and so it goes. That because again, markets are very good at finding niches. And as I said, sometimes one of the things I wrote is that coal for domestic fuels in 1940, coal was a much better product than it was in 1920. And there's nothing like the spur of losing your market to make you improve your product. And that's what they did. Coal is a better sized, there's much less dirt in it, and so on and so forth. So when that happens, it's much harder to get rid of coal. It's a much better fuel than it once was.
So what are the key takeaways that you would like anyone who engages with your book to come away with?
I hope that people will come away impressed with, I think, really two things. One is the way conservation and energy efficiency have been part of the American story from the very beginning. That the emphasis has often been on the bad things about energy. There's been an immense amount written about smoke pollution, one of the wicked things that happens when you burn coal, and so on. But very little has been written about other aspects, and waste, for example. Americans wasted energy. Well, I tried to point out that there is waste, but that one needs to be careful using that term, because some of what people call waste simply was that it wasn't economic to get that out of the ground. And so the progressives who decried that kind of waste were essentially saying, well, what we should do is we should reduce the standard of living for modern people, that is, their people, so that we could save coal for people 100 years from now, and they won't want it because we don't want the coal now. So there's a good argument for, if it's uneconomic, leave it in the ground. So that isn't waste by an economist's definition. Okay, so one needs to be careful about that. So I wanted people to come away with at least a willingness to entertain the prospect that there was more to the history of American energy than a riot of waste and debauch like that. Um, and to go back to something I said earlier, to come away with an appreciation for the subtleties of how energy has transformed our lives. And the best example of that, I didn't invent. An economist at Yale, William Nordhaus, did the first stuff on this, talking about how well do economists capture the benefits from light. And the short answer is not very. And I did a similar thing like that. 1850, you burned candles. 1860, you burned gas. Okay. And the change is incommensurate. But in 1900, you burned gas too. But it is a very different experience. You got much more light from a dollar's worth of gas in 1900. And you did that because they're more efficient in getting gas from the coal, and because they're more efficient in transforming that gas into light. And people have gone back and done the calculations about how much light did people, measured in lumens, did people actually have from candles and early gas lights. And it was a dim world, very dim. I did some calculations about the amount of light they would have. It's like burning 140-watt bulb or something like that for a long period of time. And you get to 1900, before electricity really starts to make a dent. And the amount of light that people have is dramatically different. And that's true whether they're burning kerosene or burning gas. And that's just one example of those kinds of hard to measure, but very important changes that have made your life and mine a little easier and a little better than your grandfather's and grandmother's lives were. And I hope people will think about that when they read this book and come to appreciate what those things have made. And I ended the book by saying that this is a book about the rise and fall of old King Coal. And coal is a dirty fuel. We don't use much of it anymore. But there was a time when coal dominated the American economy. And the way economies work is what we can do now depends upon what those people were able to achieve then, because we built on them. And so the way I ended the book was say that if we are rich now, part of the reason is because we stand on the shoulders of the men and women of 1900, and they stood on old King Coal. And I thought that was a pretty good summary of coal's importance to us.
I agree. And I think at this point, for anyone who wants to know more, I think it's fair to tell them they should go out and secure a copy of the book for themselves.
Buy two.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much for sitting down with me today. I really appreciate the conversation.
Well, thank you very much for asking. I appreciate that too.
Yep. And for anyone out there listening, if you want to listen to more episodes like this or learn more about Hagley, you can visit us at www.hagley.org. That's hagley.org. Or if you just want to listen to more episodes of this podcast, you can find us on YouTube, SoundCloud, or wherever else you get your podcast. Thanks. Until next time.